Okay, can I just check that you can see the screen properly?
Yes, very good.
Excellent. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Look, I'm going to begin back in the 1970s. Um, Going back to Melbourne, at that time there was an upsurge of increasing hospital-acquired antibiotic-resistant microorganisms. And there was concern about that. It was assumed that an important driver of that was inappropriate antibiotic prescribing, but at that time, there weren't agreed standards for treatment that were generally available. So a group of microbiologists, including you might see here, Ken Harvey. He's a medical microbiologist, public health physician. He's had positions with Monash University. Um, Ken Harvey and a group of clinical pharmacologists, pharmacists, physicians, a number of people from different teaching hospitals developed evidence-based recommendations on the treatment of choice for common infections. And they packaged it in a neat little booklet called the Antibiotic Guidelines. And having done that, they could measure practice against these standards of practice. And they did that. They found that people didn't practice in accord with guidelines, that broader spectrum antibiotics were being used, where narrower spectrum antibiotics were recommended. They also found that distributing just the antibiotic guidelines did not make a lot of difference. And to be clear, at that time, the notion of clinicians needing and using guidelines did not sit well with many clinicians. So this led to another movement. The guidelines were promoted with some clever advertising, drawing on the techniques of the pharmaceutical industry. And so that poster on the right there, the juicy bits are on page 14, was drawing people's attention to guideline recommendations for the treatment of community-acquired pneumonia. And it's quite effective at getting at least the younger doctors to look at that point in the antibiotic guidelines. So I think it's fair to say that this early work was on the frontiers of implementation science and behavioural change. So the campaign was remarkably effective and resulted in the shift of use from what was a problem then, IV amoxicillin for community-acquired pneumonia, to the preferred agent of the more narrow spectrum benzyl penicillin. And however, the old habits started to come back again after 12 months or so. So the success of the program was a seed for a whole range of activities. It was clear that ongoing auditing and education campaigns were needed, and some of this was necessary to counter what was pretty active promotion from the pharmaceutical industry. And so this evolved into a fairly standardised quality assurance cycle where guidelines were updated, there was review, there was targeted education and feedback to clinicians. Other behavioural techniques were also developed and implemented, and one very important one was academic detailing. Now, this had been trialled in the US, led by Avon and Sumarai, and then it was trialled in Victoria, trying to influence prescribing for upper respiratory tract infections, and it was successful. And then it was rolled out in parts of South Australia by a group called Dartnell. And then finally, when MPS was established, it became a national activity for general practice, and it was a way to reach clinicians in their place of practice with one-on-one, face-to-face, customised education. It was based on the principles of social marketing and adult learning. Another thing that was important at the time was this focus on the rational use of drugs, as it was called, established the importance of drug and therapeutics committees. That was very important for providing a strong governance to supporting the implementation of formularies, guidelines, audits and education. Then further, the guidelines, they expanded their remit from antibiotics to a full range of common diseases and complaints. And alongside of that, the Australian Medicines Handbook was established to provide independent information about all drugs in common use. And it was important to capitalise on all this success, on the new understanding of what could be done, the momentum of activity and the movement of aligned people. And this group of people were key in driving the development of medicines policy. Now, in particular, an important person on this was Yong Kwok, who was driving it from the perspective of consumers. She was from the Consumers Health Forum, and she initiated debate with a whole range of stakeholders on whether or not Australia should develop a national medicines policy after it looked at an analysis of the Australian system against the WHO model of drug policy. The first step was developing a policy on the quality use of medicines, focusing on trying to improve the way medicines were being used. And then finally and formally, in 2000, there was a national medicines policy from the Australian government. And that gives legitimacy and enduring tenure to a whole raft of activities to improve the use of medicines. And the policy has 4 pillars. The first of those to ensure medicines meet appropriate standards of quality, safety and efficacy, and that's achieved through the regulatory work of the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Secondly, that there's equitable access. So the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme is there to provide timely access to medicines at a cost individuals and the community can afford. Thirdly, that there's a viable and responsible pharmaceutical industry. And fourthly, a central tenet to hold these different aspects of the policy together is around the quality use of medicines. And the MPS medicine-wise was established to be the steward for quality use of medicines. So reflecting on all this, I think you could ask many people across Australia what they would expect of such a policy. And in particular, I think they could articulate that they need access to medicines when they need them at a cost that they can afford, and hopefully they also add at the cost the community can afford. And obviously this is such a super important objective for Australia right now. And just one further point on that policy, Lloyd Stanson, as former chair of the PBAC, made this point. Australian government does not buy medicines through the PBS, it actually buys health outcomes. So first came the policy on quality use of medicines in '94, then in 2000 a national medicines policy which absorbed the quality use of medicines policy, and then there was a separate strategy for quality use of medicines that was formulated and available in 2002, and some of the principles of that strategies around the primacy of the consumer, working in partnership with all the key stakeholders and being consultative and collaborative, etc. I think quality use medicines, however, is harder to articulate. I'm not sure that consumers easily understand what we mean by quality use medicines. What we're trying to convey is that treatment options need to be selected wisely, and that includes considering non-medicine options, choosing suitable medicines if a medicine is actually deemed necessary, and using them safely and effectively. Now I'm going to go back to the ground level. MPS had a history of working in the antibiotics area for a long period of time, but for the last several years it hasn't been active. It's outside of our current contract. But to summarise some of the qualitative research that we did some years ago to understand why many consumers want antibiotics for respiratory related infections. Australian we surveyed about 2,000 consumers at the time. Consumers generally perceived that the personal benefits of using antibiotics for cold and flu far outweighed any personal cost. In particular, they think that antibiotics help them recover faster from the cold and flu, they're safe, and probably most importantly, can help your kids go back to school or daycare and you can go back to work. So as an example of how we approached our work based on the findings from research such as that, a truth for the consumer could be said to have been that people underestimate the impact and duration of coughs, colds and flu, that they actually last a lot longer than what they might think. As well, at the same time, they overestimate the benefits of antibiotics. And so then we would message or say that antibiotics won't speed up your recovery from your cold and flu. Another one, or another truth, antibiotic resistance is someone else's problem and nothing to do with me. And so we would position, you could be responsible for antibiotic resistance. Now, just going back to some of the survey work we did with consumers back in 2015 and 2017, and just focusing in on one question. Obviously,
Jonathan,
yes.
You're at your 12-minute mark.
Okay, all right, I'm wrapping up. This is excellent. So the immediacy of the impact of the problem will drive how people respond. Most people really didn't know how to respond to that question, when will antibiotic resistance affect me? And few would say that it's affecting them now. But in 2017, we saw quite a significant step up. So that means that people were becoming much more concerned about it. So to conclude, the focus that started on antibiotics was a precursor to the development of medicines policies, and it was really important that there's a whole cascade of things that happened and are important in the environment now. National AMR strategy has been well supported by stakeholders, but community awareness is probably low. And I would say, in my opinion, Australians probably cannot articulate what they should expect from government policy around AMR in the way that they can for medicines and national medicines policy.